From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening and welcome. Good evening. Thank you for that. Let's try that again. Good evening and welcome. Good evening. Thank you. My name is Becky Brasington Clark, and I have the privilege of directing the Library of Congress Publishing Office. We're delighted to see this crowd here, particularly on such a beautiful day after such cold weather, that you actually chose to come inside and stay inside for a while is really a testament to your conviction in this program. Tonight, in celebration of the 60th anniversary of National Library Week, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Kenneth Breisch, author of American Libraries, 1730 to 1950. Dr. Breisch's book is the latest in the acclaimed Norton Library of Congress visual source book in American Architecture, Design, and Engineering series. This series is a project of the Center for Architecture, Design, and Engineering in the Library of Congress, which was established through a bequest from a distinguished American architect, Paul Rudolph, to support the library's preservation of collection items in these fields and to increase public knowledge of and access to them. Following Dr. Breisch's talk, the Emeritus Founding Director of the Center, Ford Petros, will say a few words about the architecture of the Jefferson Building and give you some insight into what you're about to see on the post-lecture tour. I want to offer a few thanks before introducing Dr. Breisch. First of all, Nancy Green, the series editor at W.W. Norton, who worked on this series for many, many years and was a real inspiration and driving force behind the books in this series. And she can't hear us because she's not here tonight, but she knows how much we appreciate her great work on this series. And I also want to thank library colleagues who came together to make this evening possible, especially Helena Zinkum, Mari Nakahara, Barbara Natanson, Ford Petros, Yamil Forbes, Steve Hirsch, Brett Cornell, Catherine Blood, Laura Chipchick, Mary Mundy, Melissa Lindberg, Donna Collins, Cheryl Kennedy, Peggy Wagner, Susan Rayburn, Amy Hess, Hannah Freese, Cheryl Lowe, and Sean Miller. And I'm sure I've missed a couple of people, and for that I offer groveling apologies. Finally, it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenneth Breisch. Dr. Breisch is an associate professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California. He's the former director and founder of USC's graduate program in Heritage Conservation. He has taught at Sci-Arc, the University of Delaware, and the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of Henry Hobson Richardson and the Small Public Library in America and the Los Angeles Central Library, Building an Architectural Icon, 1872 through 1933. We had the privilege of chatting with Dr. Breisch for a few minutes while he was pre-signing the books, which are available for purchase in the back. And we learned that he has been kind of obsessed with libraries for many, many years. And among Library of Congress employees, that's a great badge of distinction. So without further ado, Dr. Kenneth Breisch.
Thanks, Becky. The truth be told, I just like hanging out with librarians. That's well, you've thanked many of the people I was going to thank, but I should repeat at least briefly. I want to thank you, Becky, and Ford Petros, and Helena Zinkum in the Department of Prints and Photographs, Amy Hess in the publishing office, who did an amazing job tracking down with her eagle eye the details in terms of the URLs for all of the illustrations, which you'll see in the book. Nancy Green at Norton, and then Daniel Greenberg and Susan Steinhauser, who actually helped subsidize the book with their foundation in Los Angeles, and so I'm very grateful to them. And then Katie Horick, who was one of my graduate students, who well, was a graduate student many years ago when the book was started, who helped me get going on the book. This lecture is going to be very general and just a kind of introduction, I think, to what's in the book, but also the book itself is intended as an introduction to illustrations in the Department of Prints and Photographs, or the division, I should say, of Prints and Photographs at the Library of Congress. And so the images were chosen from what they have in their collections. Hence, which is a question I get often, why the book ends in 1950. They're now collecting more images of post-1950 or post-World War II buildings, but there just were not enough images to really make an argument for the history of post-World War II library buildings. Additionally, maybe I should be grateful that they didn't have the images, because as of now, I think there are almost 17,000 public library buildings alone in the United States. That includes branch libraries, large libraries, and that's not including, of course, college, university libraries, etc. So maybe, as I say, I should be thankful that I had an excuse not to try to deal with that. But they do have wonderful resources, and that's one of the purposes of the book. They have the Carol Highsmith collection. She's the one who's filling in now the post-war images, and you'll see some of those at the end of my book. Beautiful color photographs. The Detroit Publishing Company archives, the Farm Security Administration, the Gottshaw Schleisner collection, Theodore Hrydzak, I think, collection, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and of course the Historic American Building Survey, and many others that I used as a source of reference for this book. I can't see, actually, but that should be right. Yes. I'll trust that we're on the right slides here. It's especially a privilege, I think, to be speaking about libraries in the Thomas Jefferson building. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, believed fervently in public education and education as the foundation for American democracy. And one of the primary focuses of his philosophical program was the founding of the University of Virginia as a public educational institution. And the centerpiece of that campus, of that Enlightenment-inspired campus, was the rotunda, or the library, replacing what actually in Europe and the United States, it's the early colleges, had been the chapel. So it reflects his, as I say, Enlightenment interests in education. Libraries, of course, extend much further into the past than, of course, Jefferson, back to the legendary, of course, Library of Alexandria, 300 BC in the Ptolemies, and then up through the Middle Ages and the next the Codex Amiatus, which shows Ezra writing the law. This was published in the late 16th century, as I think you can see. I find it really fascinating in that the fundamental requirements of the library have really changed very little over time. This could almost be a computer carol, except that there are books there. But you have to have ample storage for your collections, depending upon the size, a quiet, comfortable, well-lit, hopefully, place to read, or now to access your computer, although I still read. And then as libraries became larger, of course, stations or desks for the distribution of books, or the charging of books, for the distribution of information to library patrons. And then, as we know at the Library of Congress, a great variety of spaces for administrative activities, sorting books, repairing books, just bureaucratic work in many different ways. So that libraries really can come in any kind of size, shape, or form. Do we have Roy's? wonderful library. Ansel Adams was commissioned to document the internment camp during World War II at Manzanar, where there were 100,000 Japanese, or 10,000 at Manzanar, but interned during the war. Roy Takano actually was the editor of the camp newspaper, and this is his library, which you can imagine was very, very precious to him. And I find it fascinating, too, that while Ansel Adams, the great American photographer, was recording the architecture in the camp, that he zeroed in on this small, but as I say, very precious kind of collection of books. This, of course, is a private collection, and it's one of a variety of different types of libraries that are talked about in the book. The Loganian Library, which you can see here, I think, is in a way a descendant of or related to Benjamin Franklin's Library Company of Philadelphia, which he founded in 1731. But James Logan's library was a private collection, probably the largest, or nearly the largest in the country at the time, numbering some 2,600 volumes. And he built this small building to house it. It's the first, actually, I think, purpose-built public library, or library building in the United States. He made his money in the fur trade. He was a close associate of the Penn family, one of the wealthiest people in the country. But he allowed scholars and others into the library to use the collection. It's one, of course, of dozens of private libraries here in Washington. The Folger Shakespeare Library, for example, but the Morgan Library, the Huntington Library in Los Angeles, all of which are private libraries that house collections that were accumulated by individuals who love books, and then, for the most part, opened them up to scholars and the public. But these libraries, to me, remind me often of a quote in Alberto Manuel's book, The Library at Night, which, if you don't know it, you should, in which he writes in the introduction, "No one stepping," and this could apply to many, many libraries, but especially these research libraries, I think. "No one stepping for the first time into a room made of books can know instinctively how to behave, what is expected, what is promised, what is allowed. One may be overcome by horror at the clutter or the vastness, the stillness, the mocking reminder of everything one doesn't know, the surveillance. And some of that overwhelming feeling may cling on even after the rituals and conventions are learned, the geography mapped, the natives found friendly." I feel that way about my research often, and the natives are always found friendly eventually, but it can be intimidating, certainly, to enter foreign territory and foreign libraries. The book also has a chapter on the Library of Congress. We'll be fortunate today to see parts of it that I haven't seen, actually, and that many people haven't seen. But as you probably know, I think you're all mavens of the Library of Congress, but it was founded in 1800 by legislation by Congress, and then burned in the War of 1812, in 1814 actually, and owes its resurgence in large part at that time to Thomas Jefferson again, who in 1815, in debt as he often was, sold his library of some 5,000 or 6,000 books. Some of them have survived to the Library of Congress. There was grumbling on the part of congressmen as to why they would be spending money, especially on books that they couldn't read because many were in Latin or Greek or other French even, foreign languages. Things don't change much, I guess, in some ways. But that formed the core of a real research library for Congress, the government, but also other individuals. Eventually, in 1851, a new structure was built in the library to house the books. This is by Thomas Eustick Walter. It was a fireproof iron construction because there had been a second fire just previous to this in which many of Jefferson's books actually were unfortunately destroyed, as well as other books. This served as the Library of Congress really up until it was replaced by this building, which began actually to be contemplated in the early 1870s. The proliferation of books and the Copyright Act, which required books to be placed in the Library of Congress, meant that this small library was very quickly outgrown, so that in 1873, Congress authorized a competition for the new Library of Congress. Here you could see an entry by Alexander Esty, actually in the collection in prints and photographs. There are dozens and dozens of these drawings. This will have to do for an exterior. It's the late 19th century. You can imagine every eclectic style was submitted by good and not so good architects. The idea, though, was to model it on the British Museum reading room, and most of the entries had a rotunda or circular reading room at the center of the collection. This is by John Fraser. These are just examples. The next is a detail. I think we're lucky we got what we got and not this perhaps, but this was his proposal for the reading room, which ultimately, as designed by Smith, Meyer, and Peltz, beginning with their final designs, they actually entered the early competition in 1888, resulted in the reading room that we have today that you're all familiar with. But it really only forms a central focus of the library. Something we'll see today are the stacks that open up around that library, stacks that were designed to hold millions of books, one of the largest libraries at the time, and also a very modern library with equipment designed by Bernard Green, conveyor belts, pneumatic tubes to convey orders from patrons to librarians in the shelves or in the stacks, and then they would be loaded onto conveyors and delivered back to the delivery room. So I find that interesting as well when we talk about modern technology in the library, that it's really not all that new to some extent, although they didn't have computers certainly at the time. There are other types of libraries that form their own chapters in the book, society libraries. These were private libraries that were actually founded by individuals who pooled their money, often paid an annual or monthly fee to be members of the library. This is the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island, the earliest surviving building related to a society library, sometimes called Athenea. Sometimes they were in basements of churches, other times they did have buildings, but these were put together, as I say, by individuals, not just men, but women as well. Women, as we move into the 19th century, became the great readers, and reading clubs and library clubs actually formed the foundation or the basis for many of the public libraries in the United States. They were dissolved often in the collections given to the city or the public library when that became available. And public libraries form a major focus of the book. As I say, we're just skimming the surface here. From a book recording the reception of George Peabody at the Peabody Institute in 1856. George Peabody was an American financier in London, actually a patron of Morgan as well, who in 1852 gave $20,000 to his native village of South Danvers in 1868, renamed Peabody, Massachusetts, in his honor. He arrived in 1856, and all of the children led him through the town with processions and speeches and a great celebration. This happened dozens and dozens of times all across the United States in the 19th century. The public libraries were very often endowed by wealthy individuals who gave money back back to their communities, with mixed motives, I suppose, but it did establish, by 1900, some 500 library buildings, public library buildings in the United States. These grew in size. Here, the Peabody Institute in Baltimore, one of the great hall libraries, and one of the only ones that survive, actually. Great cast iron structure, again, to be fireproof, built in 1855. There were others, such as the Boston Public Library, the first one before the one we know today, which you can see here, which was also a hall library. These were primarily reference libraries, academic libraries. The books were fenced off. The librarians would get them for you, but you could read them if you had the proper introduction, often in the center of the room. The Boston Public Library has a whole nother history, however. In the basement was a public lending library, where it was decided that they would lend books free of charge to any citizen of Boston. There was a lot of debate about that, whether they'd ever see the books again, whether they'd come back filthy or with diseases. There was even debate about closing off the lending library at one point, because the workers were all coming in unshowered and quite odoriferous, I guess, smelly at the time. Justin Windsor, the longtime librarian, the founding librarian at the Boston Public Library, argued strongly against that. He said, put in a new ventilation system, which they did. And so it remained a great public library. The second library in Boston, which you can see here, of course, marks the end of the 19th century, the beginning of what's often referred to as the American Renaissance, a new or neoclassical revival that swept across the country. Did you show the reading room already, or? Yeah, okay, that's fine. You saw the reading room. It actually was modeled on the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris, but you can see that even here in the United States, it became even more sort of neoclassical than this French library of the mid-19th century. There were smaller public libraries as well. Henry Hobson Richardson out of Boston really created an important prototype, in part based on the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève. I don't have a pointer, and even if I did, you can leave that there for the moment. You can see that the book wing actually derives and is an Americanized kind of version of the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève. Book wings were storage areas. Up until this time, they were at the back of the building as just rooms for storing books. Richardson rotated it around so you could identify this as a library, as well as a public library with a grand kind of entryway. Richardson was working in the later 19th century. By the end of the century, smaller libraries also. Just an example of his impact. And then the next one, I guess. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, small libraries, too, were taking on a neoclassical kind of format. This is a beautiful little building in a very small town in Massachusetts, in Conway, Massachusetts, up in the northern part of the state. It's a great surprise to find it at the end of the main street. It was built by Marshall Field, who was born in Conway, and of course moved to Chicago and founded the great department store empire, and he gave this back to the community. It's by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, who were the successor firm to Richardson, but you can see how the style shifted at this point. And the plan itself begins to take the form, although it will become more and more open in the 20th century, of typical small public libraries of the first decade or two of the 19th century, with the reading rooms to either side of a central charging desk or librarian's desk. There were larger libraries as well that reflect this new neoclassicism, but also the growing importance of public libraries. The Boston Public Library sort of kicked things off, but then, of course, we have the great New York Public Library by Carrera and Hastings, designed by its librarian, John Shaw Billings, reading room, covers actually a 1/4 acre of space, and was set atop, and the next slide you can see from the back, set atop the stacks, which had all of the same kinds of conveyor belts and tubes and other things, but now the books could just rise up to the central delivery area in the library. But again, I find it interesting. This faces, of course, the park, Bryant Park, but you can identify this immediately as a library because you can recognize, if you know what you're looking at, the stacks that are an integral part of the library. In New York, it was joined in the early 20th century by over 60 branch libraries. Actually, in around 1901, Andrew Carnegie gave the city $5.2 million to build 67 neighborhood libraries, which really became the focus of his attention. He wanted to educate the working classes and Americanize him. He had probably mixed motives as well, but the branch libraries were a big part of his program, but not, of course, the only part. Everybody knows Carnegie Libraries. Oh, there's Mr. Carnegie. And then the next, which marks the beginning, really, of his library building program. He began in 1886 to build buildings in his steel mill towns, again, sort of giving back to the community, but also placating the workers. Homesteads, some of you know, perhaps not because of the library, but because of the strike, a very violent strike. This was built shortly afterwards, and it was intended as a community center. There was an auditorium, a swimming pool, a library, and then the next, and Marion, the librarian, would probably be appalled, but a pool hall as well, which did not become a regular part of his program as he began to offer money for the construction of public libraries to any community in the United States which would agree to fund the library, the maintenance of the library in perpetuity at 10% of the cost of the building. So if he gave $10,000 for a building, there had to be legislation to make sure that there was $1,000 a year to buy books and to pay salaries and maintain the building. Carnegie was a great believer in self-help. He wasn't going to give you everything. He wrote an essay, a famous essay in 1889 called Wealth, in which he argued that you could help, but people had to help themselves ultimately. And they did, and they helped themselves to his libraries, I guess. Is the Nebraska up there? They spread all across the, I'm sorry, yeah, Iowa. That's the one that should be there. Spread all across the country due to his largesse. Between 1889 and 1900, he endowed 37 new library buildings in the United States, including the old Washington Public Library, which many of you know, which I think is going to be resurrected finally, I hear. And then by 1917, the outbreak of the war, when his program ended, he had built 1,679 libraries in the United States, spreading in large part this kind of neoclassical style to these small communities where these buildings really stood out as monumental structures within the community, as symbols of culture and learning as well. So in some ways, perhaps, Carnegie led, his endowment led to things he didn't really expect necessarily, but it spread the public library movement all across the United States. And through his personal secretary, modern library design. James Bertram in 1911, who actually answered all of the correspondence from everybody who asked for a library. As I say, almost 1,700 were built. There are dozens of reels of microfilm at Columbia of his correspondence that survive. It's actually quite amusing. Sometimes he and Carnegie were great believers, along with the librarian Melville Dewey, in spelling reform, which you can perhaps see on this slide. But he published his short pamphlet in which he said that these diagrams were intended to be suggestive rather than mandatory for communities that wanted to build libraries. Nowhere did they say they should be classical, but that was the style at the time for a number of reasons that we don't have time to go into. But ultimately, his goal was, as he says, to obtain for the money the utmost amount of effective, and that's not a misspelling, accommodation consistent with good taste in building. And his correspondence follows that scheme. But it introduced this idea of the open plan for the public library, so that the librarian from the central charging desk could keep an eye on everybody in the library, as well as the books at the rear of the building, depending on the size. Carnegie also endowed many academic libraries, including the Tuskegee Institute Library, which you see here, designed by the professor of architecture there, Robert Taylor. Here, a view of Carnegie with Booker T. Washington and others celebrating that particular library. So academic libraries are another story. We saw the exterior of the rotunda. One of the ideas of the book is to look at the different configurations and planning of libraries, which you could get some sense of tonight, perhaps. Here's a circular library, which Jefferson designed as a rotunda, or the first library at Harvard, what was the largest library in the country at the time, Gore Hall at Harvard, which was designed to hold 100,000 books. The Boston Athenaeum, another private library, was almost equivalent. Josiah Quincy, the president at the time, for some reason celebrated this and asked that it be designed in the Gothic style, saying that it was designed somewhat in the form of the chapels of many Catholic churches. And I've never been able to figure out why Protestant Harvard would be interested in Catholic churches, but you can see here an example of a hall library, and then the exterior, it looks like a Gothic church. Academic libraries, of course, led the way in terms of expansion. One of the largest earlier libraries was the Sterling Memorial Library at Yale. James Gamble Rogers, who designed many other buildings there. Here you can see how he displays the size of the $5 million volume collection this was intended to hold in 16 tiers of metal stacks, which again are indicated on the exterior by this great kind of tower, I guess, to compete with Harvard, probably in terms of size. The section on libraries ends with Frank Lloyd Wright, who did design not just the Guggenheim, but the Rue Library at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, which you can see here just before the war. The reading room is fascinating. Do you have the reading room is the next there? Which again is centralized, actually perhaps even, although Wright would deny it, I'm sure, a kind of reflection of Jefferson's library at Virginia, although much more organic and lyrical than the classicism of Jefferson, the great drama of sweeping curves in the interior. So that really kind of covers the focus of the book. There's an afterword. I felt it necessary to include some of the great late masterpieces, almost all photographed again by by Carroll. There's, of course, the great Beinecke Library to hold the Beinecke collection of rare books at Yale. Louis Kahn's Phillips Exeter Academy. Again, look back to the Hall Library tradition, but with a great kind of explication of the structure of the building. A really incredible interior. And then finally, we could end with one of the recent, again, masterpieces, but a new experiment in terms of library design, the Seattle Public Library by Rem Koolhaus, which is designed as a series of ramps which sort of spiral up in a rectangular way from what he calls the living room through a series of bookshelves and computer spaces designed to hold 1.4 million volumes. It opens up looking out over the city of Seattle, especially from the 10th floor where the reading room is located. Again, really in the tradition of the Boston Public Library in some ways, but of course in a very modern and progressive kind of style. So that's sort of it for a kind of overview. If you have questions, I don't know if we have time for questions because we have tours lined up. Did I get through it? Yes. You said that the purpose of a Hall library was just for the librarian to keep tabs on the Hall Library actually, it's not so much the Hall Library, it's sort of later modern planning. But yeah, that would be part of it. The librarian could keep an eye on everything. But it was a style that actually developed in the early Renaissance period. The Ambrosian Library in Milan was one of the first hall libraries. I think it was just a way of stacking the books around the reading room as much as anything and enclosing it. And collections were beginning to grow, so they needed more space, especially for the Ambrosian Library, which was one of the largest at the time. But it became one of the early typologies for American public libraries, which you can see in the book after 1860 or so. Any other? Yes, ma'am. In terms of form, yes, to some extent, but we were the great library builders, really, I think. The idea of, and maybe this doesn't quite answer your question, but the idea of the public lending library was invented in the United States, and it's one of the great inventions along maybe with national parks that we gave to the world, I suppose. European libraries were much more restrictive. And of course, in more autocratic countries, the rulers didn't want people reading books. So there wasn't a proliferation of libraries. There were academic libraries like the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève for students. They're even suspicious of that because the students would take to the streets. But for the most part, collections were private, and so not on the same scale. There are some exceptions, but I think we really developed this whole idea of the library as really the centerpiece, not just of learning and democracy, but of culture and community, which is something I didn't talk a lot about, but it's kind of interesting that public libraries are returning to the idea of the Athenaeum. They never really gave it up, but these are places for showing films, for story hour for younger patrons, but for lectures and other community kinds of events, as well as now computer access. Any other?
How many libraries have you seen in person?
Oh, me? I don't know. I lost track long ago. I've been doing this for way too long. It's just they all blend together after a while, maybe like mush in my head. I don't know. A lot. But there, as I say, there are now, almost 17,000 of these little guys around. So I have a long way to go, although I may turn to other things one of these days. So probably people, is there another? People are anxious to see the gallery, I think. As am I. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.